Hi, good morning, everyone. We're at 11 o'clock, so I think it's a good point to start our webinar today. And welcome to today's presentation, which is focusing on climate change and really the emissions reductions imperative. Just very briefly, we will have a fantastic cross-section of speakers today, providing some really great perspectives, starting off with Mark Baker-Jones, who's the Director of Policy and Regulation at Te Whakahaere. That will be followed by a presentation from Helen Maloney, who's a Senior Corporate Sustainability Advisor at Auckland Council, and Francis Satano, who is the Group Financial Controller at Auckland Council. And rounding us off for the day will be Marcus Benter Lynch, who's from Tonkin and Taylor, and he's the Strategic Advisor, Sustainability and Climate Change. For my sins, my name is Jason Krupp. I'm your facilitator for the day, and I'm Deputy Chief Executive at LGNZ. For those of you who don't know, LGNZ is the local government peak body. First of all, I just want to say it's fantastic to have you all here today. We had 125 people registered for the webinar today, and that comes from a really good cross-section of local government, private sector. We've got iwi Māori perspectives, NGO perspectives, all joining us today, which I really think reflects the growing awareness that we're all in this together and that climate change is a global threat, and we're all going to have to make changes, be adaptive and be flexible if we're going to adapt to the world of the future. Now, from my perspective, I'm fascinated in climate change from a local government perspective, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Councils and local government will play a primary role in the fight against climate change, both from a mitigation and adaptation point of view, but also a very important coordinating role as our economy and society decarbonizes, and also a very important role in ensuring that that transition is equitable and sustainable. So I'll be listening just as much as I'm facilitating here today. Just a quick reminder before we start with our first panelist of the day that we do have a number of polls going, so please use the facility in the webinar functionality to vote on those polls, and please sharpen up your questions for our panelists as we go, and please submit those in the chat function. We will not be crossing to any live questions, so if you have a burning question, put it in the chat function and we'll deal with those at the end of the session after all the speakers have spoken. So without further ado, let me hand you to our first speaker of the day, Mark Baker-Jones.
E mihi ana hau kia koe te manakura Jason, tēnā koe, kia oko hoa rārangi paipai, tēnā koutou, he mihi kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. So as Jason, thanks for that introduction. As Jason said, I'm a director at Te Whakahaere. My background is in law. I'm a lawyer, but my work has largely been in climate change policy and regulatory here in Aotearoa, but also in Australia and the Pacific. And also I just want to say a big thank you to Tonkin and Taylor for running this session of the Auckland Climate Festival and inviting me to speak. Tēnā koutou. So I've been asked to talk about governance considerations around transition and ideas for strategy and action. And there's really a lot in that. And I think to understand what we mean when we're talking about climate governance and transitioning, we need to talk about some other key concepts like climate-related financial risk and disclosure of that risk. And for my part, at the heart of all this is really understanding what climate-related financial risk is. So I'll try and cover off on that first. And if we go back to basics, when we produce something that emits greenhouse gases, so like a cow, the methane from that cow is sent into the air, it collects, and with all those other gases, and it creates heat and it disrupts weather. What that disruption means is that we might get too much rain, say, and the rivers flood and it causes damage, and someone has to pay for that. And it might equally mean we don't get enough rain and crops fail and someone has to pay for that too. But I'll just stick with the cost of those floods. Those costs can be varied. They might be that the flood washes out a bridge, so there's a cost to replace that bridge. And it might also be that because that bridge is out, people in that community can't get to work, they can't get to school. So there's a cost in lost wages or extra travel time and business disruption. So what we've seen in the past is that government comes along and it rebuilds that bridge, but it passes that cost of the damaged infrastructure, that bridge, onto the public or the community via rates or taxes. So if we go back to that cow, the source of the methane that causes the damage, the farmer in its production process produces the methane, but the cost of the methane, the damage it causes to the bridge and business disruption gets paid by the ratepayer. But when the cow is sold, the farmer is the only one that gets paid. The farmer doesn't pay a share of the profit to the ratepayer, so only the farmer gets the benefit. You know, the ratepayer thinks, well, look, that's unfair. Why am I paying for the damage from the production of the cow and yet the farmer gets all the profit? You know, if the farmer gets all the profit, then the farmer should pay all the costs. And what the ratepayer is in effect saying is that rather than the ratepayer paying for the damage, that climate cost, that the cost of that damage should be internalized into the cost of production. The farmer should pay for that cost. We should be internalizing the climate change cost into the product. And this is not just for farming, it's in all industries where we know the industry is emitting carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, but the ratepayers are essentially paying for it, not the industry. So how do we manage this? You know, how do we make sure that the industry pays all of its costs for the damage it's causing? Well, we do that by pricing the emissions and charging the industry for it. We measure the emissions from the cow, which we can do. We work out what the cost for the emission should be, which we know. And then we say to the farmer, if you're going to emit a ton of methane, then you have to pay the government, you know, X dollars for that ton, which the government then can spend on repairing the bridge. So this is the basis for the emissions trading scheme. It's a mechanism to make industry pay for its emissions and to stop forcing them onto the public. And so far, most of our heavy emitting industries have to work this way. They have to pay for their emissions through the emissions trading scheme. The agricultural sector has been pushing back for years now, lobbying government to avoid having to pay this share. The government set a deadline for it to start paying, but the ag sector keeps pushing back. And it's interesting that the ag sector produces nearly 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, but it only contributes about 6% to our GDP. And yet it has that powerful lobby, so it'll continue to evade this. And personally, I think the hypocrisy in that is that our government is holding itself out to be a world leader in eliminating subsidies to the oil and gas sector. It's taking a fossil fuel subsidies ministerial statement to COP, the Global Climate Conference, to phase out global subsidies to the ONG sector, but it effectively continues to subsidize one of our heaviest greenhouse gas emitters in the ag sector. But anyway, back to that example, if we internalize the cost of emissions into production, we would expect the producer to then pass on that cost, so the product would go up in price. But at least the purchaser knows what they're paying for. There are no hidden costs. And of course, there is that risk that the producer has to take a profit cut, or the product becomes too expensive and no one will buy the product, so the producer looks somewhere else to make a profit. Or the producer might change the production process to remove the emissions, and the producer keeps a profit and people continue to buy the profit. But whatever way it goes, the aim is to show the true cost of the product so people can make an informed choice. And the provision of better information is what we're talking about when we're talking about disclosing information. Now, the climate transition is largely about accounting for the cost of emissions and removing greenhouse gas emissions from industry and replacing it with non or low greenhouse gas emitting industry, and about informing. So we are transitioning from a carbon-based economy to a low carbon-based economy. And as we transition, eventually investors will shift their investment into those low emitting industries. And you'll see producers change the way they operate. They'll shift from animal protein production to plant-based protein production. We'll see a new economy developing and growing as new forms of production emerge. Those changes in land use will mean a more efficient, cleaner use of our land. And because they are more efficient, they'll free up more land for either more production or housing or recreation or environmental purposes. And our atmosphere will get cleaner and our weather systems will begin to restabilize. Okay, but now the risk. So that's all okay. The transition is fine as long as it happens at a pace that allows those companies, those old industries, to transition away from carbon or methane. But say you're an investor and you have your superannuation, you want to get a good return, and your super's invested in a petroleum company, and most of pensions are if we don't require the funds to invest them otherwise. And you see the way things are going, you see this transition happening around you, and you decide you want to get out before the petroleum company goes under. Maybe you want to switch to EVs because their share prices are rising. Now, if everyone decides to swap their investment at the same time, you could have a major crisis. It could be like a run on the bank. You could have financial instability, financial collapse as funds are suddenly moved from one industry to another, like freight moving on the deck of a ship. Suddenly, everyone withdraws their money from the fuel company and drops it in the EV company. You get a happy EV company, but then those fuel companies collapse because funds are suddenly withdrawn. So one of the really big concerns with climate change, with this transition, is that risk of financial instability as investors reallocate capital. It's that climate-related financial risk. And if investors are uninformed or they're misinformed, they're likely to reallocate their capital at the wrong time, either too soon or too late. So we come back to disclosures. Luckily, we have some very smart people who have been working on this problem of how to avoid global financial instability for a few years now, mainly driven by the Financial Stability Board. The Financial Stability Board at FSB, it's an international body whose job is to monitor and make recommendations about the global financial system. So the FSB set up a task force to look at this, and the task force came back with a simple solution, and that is that companies should be clear about whether they have a climate-related risk, what the risk is, and they should let the market know. They should make disclosure of their climate-related financial risk. And if they make disclosures early enough, investors make timely decisions and companies have time to adjust and transition, and we keep our financial system stable. And we've got companies coming to us now because they need to urgently disclose their climate risk because their shareholders don't know enough about what the company's risk is, and so they don't know how to price it, and they're getting nervous, and the companies want to keep them on board. So this is a way that companies will manage the transition. They'll manage the timing of the transition so it doesn't occur too early or too late. And what it means in practice is the global economy, which is still heavily carbon-based, is in transition to a low carbon-based economy at the moment. And this is why Aotearoa, the UK, the USA, EU, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, Brazil, everyone is introducing mandatory climate-related disclosure regimes for business and mainly financial institutions for now, so that investors can see the true risk to those companies and can be informed and make timely decisions. And the markets and businesses strongly support this because, as I said, it improves market efficiency and it's better for the planet. I can talk more about the governance and actions later, Jason, but I'll leave it there and I'll hand back to you. Kia ora.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Mark, and for taking us through the often invisible costs of climate change and how we kind of account for these through emissions trading schemes and manage that risk through TCFD frameworks. I'll now hand over to Helen and Francis to take us from that global system view down to a practical organizational view. So over to you, Helen and Francis.
Kia ora, Jason. Thank you. Kia ora, everybody. Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Helen Mahoney toku ingoa. Mahi ana o hei Sustainability Resilience Advisor. Ki te koni hera o Tamaki Makoto aho e mahi ana. So yeah, kia ora, everyone. I'm Helen and I work in the Sustainability Office at Auckland Council. Just want to say a massive thank you to Tonkin and Taylor for pulling this event together, and shout out to Michelle Kennedy for pulling together the Climate Festival for Auckland. It's been great to be part of the advisory panel, helping towards the development of the Climate Festival. And it's just great that we can have a platform where we can have conversations like this across many different networks. So today I'm going to talk to you about Auckland Council's response to climate change, and I'll touch on some of the work we're doing to reduce our emissions and our climate disclosures as well. And then I'm going to hand over to Francis, who's going to talk more about our climate disclosure journey with a bit of a focus on governance as well. Let's move to the next slide here. Okay. So Auckland Council's response to climate change is informed by Te Tarukia Tāwhiri Auckland's Climate Plan, which is our region's long-term approach to climate action. So the plan was developed in partnership with the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum and in collaboration with many stakeholders across the region, from businesses and communities to academia, rangatahi, Māori and central government. And the plan sets out 8 priority action areas to deliver on the 2 core goals of the plan. And they are reducing our emissions, so more specifically, reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And then adapting to climate change, so adapting to some of the changes we might see if we continue on our current emissions trajectory. Okay. So Auckland Council, alongside our council-controlled organisations, have set a target of reducing our own emissions by 50% by 2030, and then Ports of Auckland have also set a target to become a zero emissions port by 2040. Now, to achieve this, Auckland Council and the Council Group have identified a number of in-house emission reduction targets, as you can see here on the slide. So to help us meet these targets, we've funded a number of initiatives through our latest 10-year recovery budget. So some of these initiatives at Auckland Council include funding solar panels and electric heat pumps for our community facilities, and also implementing a sustainable asset standard policy. And that's going to improve the way, not only the way we build, but the way we maintain and renew our public assets. But this just touches on some of the work happening across council that we're doing to address our emissions. At Auckland Council at the moment, one of our main focus areas alongside reducing our emissions is really to gain a better understanding of our Scope 3 emissions and our emissions produced from capital projects. You know, we have up to hundreds of contracts actually running at any one time that have an impact on our Scope 3 emissions. So it's really a priority for us to better understand these emission sources. And to do that, we've put in place ambitious sustainable procurement targets, and we're working really closely with our suppliers to measure more of our Scope 3 emissions so that we can start to set reduction targets against them. And I kind of want to emphasize that point around working with our suppliers closely. That's been so valuable, and we wouldn't be able to continue to expand our understanding of our Scope 3 emissions without working closely with those suppliers. So as I just mentioned, this year a climate action package was included in our 10-year recovery budget, which really demonstrated Auckland Council's commitment to climate change, especially given the current environment that we find ourselves in. Of course, we still have a long way to go, but this investment really brings us closer to meeting our emission targets and helping the region prepare for climate change. So the package included investment in a number of initiatives that not only address our in-house emissions, but regional emissions and adaptation initiatives. They're listed on the slide here, but some of the few initiatives that I'll point out here is that we're going to be planting more native forests and more street trees. We're now, because of this investment, going to be able to only purchase electric and hydrogen buses from 2021, addressing one of our biggest emission source here in Auckland. And we're also carrying out a number of initiatives that are going to help our communities to reduce their own household emissions. Now, the 10-year budget is probably the biggest financial planning process that we have at Auckland Council. And to have a climate package included this year is an example of how climate change is really becoming embedded into decision-making at Council. In Te Tarukia Tāwhiri, we recognise that the successful delivery of our climate goals really does depend on, ensuring those financial flows are consistent with our climate action. And so for Auckland Council, this does mean looking at our funding mechanisms like our 10-year budget and our annual plans and aligning them with our climate goals. So, we've seen a lot of major shifts across the organisation in the last few years. We're seeing climate change definitely become more frequent as part of daily decision making and that long-term planning piece. And yeah, I guess for us, really now, it's not so much a question of whether we should or we shouldn't, but a question of how. Of course, like many other organisations, there are challenges that we have. And for us, around that decision-making piece, it's mainly around capability and consistency. So, you know, we're an organisation of 6,000 people, and we have different levels of understanding and capability across the group, across Auckland Council, relating to climate change, which means decisions, they're not always consistent. So we don't consistently assess greenhouse gas emissions or climate risks. And of course, this is a really big priority for us in the Chief Sustainability Office. So one of the ways that we are addressing this is by developing a tool that will help decision makers better understand the impacts of their decisions. So getting them to understand the high level emissions and climate risks associated with decisions, policies, plans and projects. So we're starting to see climate change become embedded in our financial planning processes. However, there's more work to do. And so we are using the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Framework as a tool to help us to do this. I'm going to refer to that as TCFD from now on then. So the council group, has been an early adopter of the TCFD recommended disclosures in New Zealand. And we've been voluntarily disclosing under the framework for the last 2 years now. In the past, for us, investors have indicated their expectation that Auckland Council disclose its climate-related risks and opportunities. So the TCFD framework provides us with that platform to do so. One thing I want to note here, though, is the TCFD framework, and like Mark has touched on earlier, it is much more than a framework for investors. It's crucial to managing that financial stability piece as we make that transition to a lower carbon economy. But for us as an organisation as well, as we implement the recommended disclosures, it means that we start setting up those crucial organisational structures that are going to enable climate considerations across all parts of our organisation. So if you look at the framework, it's shaped around 4 key areas: governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. And these are fundamental areas of any organisation, and that's why, for us, we should be looking at embedding climate change into these areas anyway. It just makes sense for us. So aside from, the compliance aspect in light of the Financial Sectors Amendment Bill that's going to be coming into play next year, it just makes sense for us to start implementing the recommended disclosures of the TCFD. And just to talk on what this means in practice for us, so it does mean fundamental changes. It means incorporating climate planning into our investment decisions. As a group, the Auckland Council group, it means we need to think about how we manage climate risk across the group and how we address our interconnected risks as well in a really collaborative way. And then also thinking about our governance structures and are they set up to enable climate action. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Francis, who's going to talk more about our climate journey and some of the challenges we've faced.
Thank you very much, Helen. Tēnā koutou. Auckland Council has been on this journey for a while now. We were the first local government organisation in New Zealand to actually publish climate-related disclosures. We published our first ones in 2019, our interim financial report in December 2019, and we've just released our 3rd disclosure as part of our annual report in September for 30 June 2021. This year, we've worked with Tonkin and Taylor to begin our scenario analysis work, and we will undergo a climate change risk assessment against the different climate scenarios. We also held a workshop with key stakeholders across the Auckland Council group to discuss the different climate scenarios and risk methodologies that we will use to complete our assessment. Tonkin and Taylor also carried out a stock take of all our climate change risk assessments for the various group entities to date and to determine the group's most material risks. This is providing us with a baseline for the group scenario analysis work. Our group scenario analysis, when it's completed, will allow us to identify the financial impacts of these risks. We will use the information from our scenario analysis to inform how climate change is embedded into our financial and our strategic planning processes, and is related to the sets of metrics and targets that we have. We've been on the journey, as I've mentioned now, for about 2 years, and we won't be fully compliant with the TCFD disclosures probably for another 3 years. From the very start of our disclosure journey, the financial risk and sustainability teams have worked together. A collaborative approach is actually fundamental to the successful implementation of the recommended disclosures of the TCFD. As an organization, we recognize that responding to climate change will require dramatic changes to our organization. This includes reducing our emissions and responding to climate change. Ensuring that we can respond to climate change is imperative, and this starts by putting the right governance structures in place. The Auckland Council governing body has delegated authority for the oversight of a region-wide climate change related matters to different committees, including the Environment and Climate Change Committee, which oversees the Te Tukuri Te Whare Auckland Council plan. Next year, we'll be undertaking a governance assessment to gain a better understanding of where our governance structures are currently working well and where we've got gaps. At Auckland Council, we've seen a significant increase in the areas across the organisation that are focused on climate change, with departments like financial control working closely with the sustainability team and our treasury team, who are responsible for our sustainable financing program. Just as an aside, we've just recently put out to market a green bond issue, and we're expecting to announce the results in the next couple of days. We acknowledge there has been more work that needs to be done around climate change to make it mainstream in our organisation. To support the delivery of our climate disclosure, we've set up a number of different groups to oversee and input into this work. This includes a governance, a reference, and a working group. The governance group is responsible for overseeing and enabling the implementation and the recommended disclosures, and it includes ensuring that climate risk management is embedded into our strategic and financial planning processes, which is why governance has been identified as one of the main focus areas for the next year. If you don't have the governance structures in place, you're not going to be able to progress very fast. And so having those right governance structures in place will ensure that we support and enable us to be successful in our implementation. Jason, thanks. That's my wrap. Over to you.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Helen, for really giving us a peek into what climate change leadership looks like at a local government level. Certainly, we've got a lot to learn from you, and the challenge ahead for the local government sector is to apply this across all of the councils in New Zealand. I'd now like to take the opportunity to hand across to Marcus to give us a different, more broader perspective on this. Marcus, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jason. Let me get straight into it. I don't think we have a lot of time today, so I'll be racing through a little bit. Kia ora koutou, ko Teufelsberg te maunga, ko Hafra te awa, no Berlin, Germany aho, ko Bentolenge toko whanau, ko Marcus toko ingoa. I was going to talk briefly about the need for a carbon inventory or a greenhouse gas inventory and some of the challenges you might encounter there, but I think given time constraints, I might just skip that one. Hopefully everyone has agreed that that's an important first step that we all need to take if we are going to look at reducing emissions, which is what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes. The point I do want to make briefly is that I think it is important we communicate the results not just from our carbon inventory, but in fact anything we do in an organisation that possibly has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Most of us will know what a litre of petrol costs at the pump, but I suspect very few of us will have an idea of how much CO2 that litre of petrol will emit when we use it in our vehicle. Or as another example, many of us might know what it costs per square metre to build a house, but how many of us know the greenhouse gas emissions associated with building a house? So I strongly encourage us all to communicate that data, build a dashboard even if you can, and really and show how you're tracking relative to your target and develop that awareness of whether 1,000 tonnes of CO2 is a lot or is a little for your organisation. Communicate to your board or to your councillors with info council reports or whatever, so everyone starts building awareness and gets a bit of context around carbon emissions. Let's assume you've got your inventory and you're starting to develop your decarbonisation roadmap. You're getting on that journey to reduce emissions. Typically, what we might do is we build a marginal abatement cost curve, which I've shown here on that slide, at least sort of in a simplified version. If you're lucky, you identify initiatives, decarbonisation initiatives that actually save you money, which would be the ones shown here on the left, third on that graph. But sooner or later, you will need to look at initiatives that aren't going to save you money, but that cost you money, so to speak, to keep it simple. And I put here the words affordable and unaffordable, and I put them there provocatively, but in quotation marks, to trigger a little bit of thinking around what we think when we say affordable or unaffordable, because some of these initiatives to reduce emissions, of course, aren't that cheap, if we put it simply. But affordable and unaffordable, of course, are terms that may or may not take into account externalities or the cost to the environment. And I think others, Mark at least has touched on that briefly earlier. So these are sort of challenge that you come up against if you haven't already started looking at your decarbonisation roadmap. And what I encourage you to do is, again, be transparent around that, talk about that, bring your stakeholders along on that journey. The sooner you talk about those challenges, the sooner, as I think Helen said, your suppliers, for example, can help you on that journey and help you find ways to reduce your emissions. Next challenge that typically comes up when we do this sort of work is that organisations aren't static, but often assume that they grow. If you're a council, you might have population growth. If you're a private organisation, you might hope that your turnover increases over time. So let's say you've done your inventory last year and it showed that your emissions were in the order of 11,000 tonnes, is the point there on the left of that graph. If you assume an average growth, I think I've assumed here 2%, and you don't do anything at all, you would get from 11,000 odd tonnes per year to north of 20,000 tonnes by 2050, rather than down if you assume growth. Let's assume you have identified some initiatives to reduce your emissions and you're starting to implement them, or at least you plan to implement them, which would be represented by the green graph on the left, the first steps there. Even if you got down to below 5,000 tonnes in, say, 2025, if then you stopped doing anything and you assumed there was growth, again, average every year, you would creep up towards the 10,000 tonnes again by 2050, rather than getting down to what you might hope for, which is to be net carbon zero somewhere by or before, hopefully, 2050. So some big challenges there when you embark on that journey. So where does it then take you? What sort of questions come up? And typically the conversation then goes to offsetting, carbon offsetting, potentially looking to future technologies that aren't available yet. or organizational change. And in the limited time that I have, and I apologize, I'm racing through a lot of concepts here very quickly. Let me just touch on those briefly, and I'm happy to talk offline further about any of them if any of you are interested. And I promised Francis to talk about the technology piece, I think, before we had this presentation. I'm going to race through it very quickly now. So I do encourage you to get in touch if you're interested to talk about this further. With regards to future technologies, and I've shown one of those that you might have seen recently pop up in your LinkedIn feeds or elsewhere. That's a direct air capture and storage plant, and I won't comment on it here in any detail, but I suggest you look very carefully at these technologies and their cost per the likely future cost of ton of CO2 avoided or cost per ton sequestered, their technical feasibility, their scalability, and perhaps most importantly, take a step back and think about their wider sustainability impacts. And what I mean by that is, don't just look at how much carbon they may or may not be able to deal with, but what the other sustainability impacts are. And I say wider sustainability impacts, and I've put that Sustainable Development Goal picture there on the right, because I think it is important that we take a step back and look at water, waste, biodiversity, but also community impacts of these technologies that we might be hoping for might be available in the future. When we look at technology with that bigger picture in mind, we can often ascertain quite quickly whether they are the answer to some of the challenges we face as a community or as an organization when we're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So leave it there. Happy to talk more about some of those technologies that are coming up. And I think we'll see a lot more, by the way, in the future as this issue becomes more and more significant. Offsetting, of course, is another option that we'll all look at when we are looking at reducing our emissions, and we've come up to those somewhat more affordable emissions, or we've invested in those. Big topic again in its own right. Let me just briefly make a couple of points. If you look at the graph there on the left, that's showing global deforestation since 1700. The point I'm wanting to make here is that deforestation alone, global deforestation alone, is contributing and has been contributing to climate change. So planting trees is something we should do regardless, is I guess what I'm trying to say, not just to offset our own emissions. In fact, I would put it the other way around. We should offset as a last resort, plant trees as a last resort if we have really tried everything else. And the other point is that forests will become a less and less reliable option in terms of offsetting emissions as they become more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which I'm trying to show there with a picture on the right, bushfires in Australia recently. So that brings me to my final point that I'd like to make, and you might wonder why I've got a slide here like that. Bear with me just for a minute. When you look at reducing emissions, and you've sort of looked at these options that I've showed on that orange and green graph there before, and you come to that point where you say, okay, well, going any further down is really expensive. What can I do? Do I want to offset? Do I hope for technology? The other option that we have is to look at our organization and how we deliver for our stakeholders, for our customers, for our staff, or whatever it might be. And I encourage you all to take a step back and look at the outcomes that you're delivering as an organization. Don't just look at how you can reduce emissions and create the same outputs as you have in the past, but take a step back and look at the outcomes. When you do that, you'll soon find that you have a number of options available to you. That's certainly what I found, or what we found working with our clients. Now, because I can't talk about specific client examples because they're typically confidential, let me share a personal little story here to illustrate that point. I was fortunate enough to travel to Central America a couple of years ago with my family just before coronavirus. And of course, I was extremely aware of the emissions associated with us flying there back to New Zealand. And so, as you can imagine, I was thinking about that and wondering if there wasn't an opportunity for us to have a similar experience without those emissions, essentially going through that process that I just suggested, taking a step back and looking at the outcome rather than the output of traveling there. How could we experience perhaps the beautiful rainforest or the coral reef or whatever, the local culture, without necessarily flying there? And so I came up with the idea that maybe we need to look at virtual online tourism, and I put that to my family at the time, and they dismissed it instantly. Said, oh, Marcus, look, no one is going to pay for that, and I left it there. About a year later, I think I was listening to Kim Hill on national radio as she interviewed someone in the North Island who was feeding lambs and charging people from overseas to watch her do that online through Airbnb, who had set up that service in response to COVID. They were based overseas. They were doing it from the comfort of their couch, and they're paid in the order of $15 to $20 per person. It is interactive, so you can ask the farmer questions about feeding the lambs. But it really amazed me that people paid money for a tourism experience in New Zealand without being here, and for something as you might agree, unspectacular as feeding lambs in the backyard. And when I prepared for this presentation, I had a quick look if that still existed, and sure enough, it did. And in fact, I don't know if you can see that at the bottom of the slide here. It was booked out last Sunday. So for me, that is an example, and I'm not saying it's a particularly good one or one that's applicable to many other organizations, but I think it shows that if you take a step back and you look at the outcomes that you're wanting to achieve rather than the outputs, you have all sorts of options what you can do, in this case here in the tourism sector, with a lot fewer, with fewer emissions, with a lot less emissions than otherwise. So I guess with that I close and encourage you all to be courageous leaders and take a step back and look at the organizations. Don't just think about offsetting and or technology, also think about whether there are changes you can make to your organization as such that help you reduce emissions significantly. And with that, back to you, Jason.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Marcus. We're about to go into the question and answer session, and if I could suggest that all the presenters turn their videos on for this so that our guests have something to look at. But before we get into the Q&A, which I'll just be taking off the polls, off the chat box itself, I just want to point out the polls. The question we asked was, does your organization have a decarbonisation roadmap or a detailed plan? Just over half of you, 52% said you're working on it. 26% of you said yes, you did. And if we add those together, I think, a couple of years ago, we would have given ourselves a pat on the back. But I think as we're getting into this, really a real challenge to shift that last 20% to be very proactive in that space. If I'm making some commentary and if I'm allowed to. Now, getting on to some of the questions here, we've got one from Carol Cohen, who's stated and then asked, it's fabulous that the Council is actively addressing the climate crisis. However, the targets that are taking us to 3+ degrees, however, why are there targets that are taking us to 3+ degrees when the Paris Agreement has a target of 1.5 degrees? I think that's more of a Auckland Council question.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Carol, for your question. So there's two components to that. So we are, our emission reduction targets do take us, are in line with the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees. However, we are planning for a 3 degrees future. There's no certainty around, what our future will look like, given that we have, the carbon concentration within our atmosphere is already quite significant. And we're already starting to see a lot of the impacts of climate change now impact the regions, such as, drought, extreme storm events, and so on. So that 3 degrees component is what we are planning for. And that includes, making sure that our infrastructure is resilient, our homes and buildings are resilient to floods and inundations. So I think that's hopefully that addresses your question there.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. Again, a good couple of questions coming in headed for Auckland Council staffers to answer. I'll ask two in a row, and the first one is the easy one. The second one is more challenging. The first one is, which year is the base year for Auckland Council for its 50-year reduction target by 2030? And the second one is from Andrew Carline, who asks, how are we going to drag Auckland Transport into this framework with the cars first, people last policies?
Great, thank you both for your questions. So our base year is 2016, and I can't speak for Auckland Transport, but we are working very closely with Auckland Transport at the moment, actually, to develop a transport emission reduction plan, and that's going to identify a pathway including specific interventions for reducing transport emissions by 2030, and that's going to help us respond to some of the our goals and some of those actions within Te Tarakia Tāwhiri.
Brilliant.
Sorry, if I could just come in there as well. I think Auckland Transport, their board has certainly in the last year moved quite significantly to start addressing this. I think that over the next couple of years, there are going to be some significant changes happening.
Brilliant. And if you think all the hard questions are going to our representatives from Auckland Council, I think we have to thank Ronnie Cooper for giving us a real curly. And he asks, how does your risk assessment include the risks and costs of the enormous adaptations that will be necessary? For example, managed retreat of entire communities, replacement of essential infrastructure and lifelines. New Zealand will inevitably be a climate change taker impacted by global systems and choices, much of which is already locked in regardless of New Zealand's low/zero carbon commitments. To give Helen and Francis a break from this, I know, Mark, you've worked in this area, so could you speak to it? And then, Marcus, could I ask you to follow? Because really this is not just a challenge for Auckland, but a challenge for New Zealand.
Thanks for that, Jason. Saw your eyes focusing in on me and targeting me for that one. And Ronnie, if this is Ronnie Cooper, I know it's hey Ronnie, how you going? So how does your risk assessment include the risks and costs of enormous adaptation? I'm not an expert in carrying out risk assessment, and I'm going to throw that back onto probably towards Marcus in your direction with the work that Tonkin and Taylor is doing. But I just have to say it's a great point. One of the big problems we're facing, and probably the focus of my present when I spoke earlier, was in ensuring that we're capturing all those costs and making it transparent, and then allowing us to make informed decisions. And you're right, Ronnie. If we're not capturing those costs of adaptation, we're not going to be making the right decisions for our future. Leah, I'll hand that over. Marcus, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, you probably stole my thunder, the little bit of thunder or whatever noise I could make on that topic. I think the trick is really to be transparent. It probably doesn't really answer your question, Ronnie. Kia ora, Ronnie. But I would encourage what I think you said, Mark, also is try to identify those costs early and make people aware. Often we are scared, I think, of disclosing or talking about some of these costs. And it's a big topic in terms of house prices and all the rest of it. But I think it's important to make people aware. The sooner we all understand what those costs are, the sooner we can prepare ourselves for it. That's my 2 cents anyway.
If I can inject in here, we've seen the emissions reduction plan come out from central government recently. And one of the topics there is, what do we do with the revenue that we get from, that governments collect from selling carbon credits? Is this a potential revenue source that we could use for paying for these adaptation actions that we know we'll need to take, and these kind of transfers in society? And just to make the question curly, because as a former journalist I feel obliged to do that, is government best placed to do that, or do we need independent institutions? And I'll open that to all four panelists.
I'm happy to jump in first, and I think the issue is that typically Treasury is reluctant to hypothecate funds towards particular actions or activities. So the problem we face when we take funds from the emissions trading scheme, like in principle, it's a fantastic idea to direct that towards a particular action or a fix to manage climate change. But in pure economics, I'm not an economist. That they tend to struggle with that because there's a risk that it's not, the market's not working as efficiently as it could be. But absolutely, there are examples, and I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but I'm certainly aware that there are situations where funds are being used from things like emissions trading schemes and carbon pricing mechanisms and used as incentive towards those that are reducing emissions or carrying out business that is seeking to reduce or sequester emissions. So it's a really good way of incentivizing that action and avoid what I talked about before, funds being distributed to the emitters in what I think is a really unfair way, rather than directing those funds towards those who are trying to make an effort to reduce emissions.
Sorry, if I could just come in there. One of the things that central government does do is that it helps fund a lot of other work that council's doing, and here I'd particularly look at Auckland Transport, where a lot of the funding is being directed by government to support cycleways, walking paths, encouraging public transport. So we're getting a lot of funding coming from central government, and it's much easier to get that funding than to build a road. So already government is redirecting the way that they are providing funding to support, and that's allowing us to do a lot more in the climate space. So yeah, I think you'll see that accelerate as well.
Marcus, Helen, any views on this?
I mean, I think it's been quite well covered off. I think, with carbon credits, it is a little bit tricky. I think there are many alternative funding and financing streams that we could look at that might be a little bit more easier to access. But I think carbon credits, I would say, is probably more of a incentive that can be used in that space.
All right, we've got a few more questions coming through. Adrian asks, is a strategic environmental impact assessment developed along the process to ensure that technologies, reduction and mitigation options and strategies do not result in adverse environmental effects on the environment, population, water, health, biodiversity, etc.? Any takers for that curly question?
It sounds like one that might be directed towards me, although I didn't quite get the actual question. Is a strategy like that useful, or what exactly was the question? Do you mind repeating, Jason? Apologies.
Yeah, I think the question is, or unpacking it a little bit with my own interpretation, I guess it's asking is, are our strategic environmental impact assessments robust enough so that when we're looking at, as you mentioned, those new carbon capture technologies, are they robust enough to capture some of those other externalities that might exist outside of that climate change, pure climate change focus or capture focus?
That's a tough question, and I'm hesitating to answer it. I suspect not, is my gut feel. I don't think they'll take the big picture view as much as they could around, what does it mean for communities and so on and so forth. But yeah, I'd love to have that conversation in a bit more detail and perhaps look at some examples to explore that further. But on the face of it, I would suspect they're a good start, but I don't think they'll go as far as they could.
Right. Mark asks, he starts with a statement, many wise folk in this space suggest that the current approaches are too superficial and essentially inadequate. And the question, I guess, is to all participants is, how are such perspectives supported and encouraged in your organizations for the purpose of bringing diverse strengths to this mahi and making it more likely that effective action can be taken, meaningful transitions can occur, and increase in equitable and holistic well-being result? Kia ora. Flipping things around, why don't we start with Mark on this one?
Thanks for that. Kia ora, Mark. Thanks for the question. Just talking generally about how we can, bringing in diversity and different ways of thinking and the strengths that brings is certainly I'm seeing this generational change in the way that the way that organisers are operating through their board membership, predominantly, where we're getting a lot more new generation, younger people coming through, people who have grown up with an understanding of how significant this issue is and how dire it is and how urgently we have to work on that. And Francis touched on that before with, Auckland Transport with their board, bringing in people who actually understand the risk and are willing to acknowledge it, and then are driving change to do something about it. So for me, I mean, you've got to have throughout your organization, you've got to have that sort of thinking. But in some ways, it starts with the board recognizing that there is an issue. And, and I'm seeing a change where, I heard so many times where boards, members of boards or some executive levels saying, like, we're quite risk averse, so we're just going to sit and watch what happens. But really what they're saying is we're running away from the risk because we don't understand it and don't want to acknowledge it. Whether we're seeing this younger generation coming through who are ready to tackle it head on and make some changes. So look, I'm really positive about that movement in our decision makers.
Francis, Helen, I mean, that's quite a challenging question.
It is, but I think, one of the things that Council has done, I mean, they started a couple of years ago when they declared it a climate emergency, and there was a lot of people around saying, oh, they're just talking. But when, if I look back over the last few years and I see the change in the thought processes and the way people are engaging within Council and in the CCOs, it's actually been quite a fundamental shift. And with us, the reason going down the TCFD route was that it forced us to actually start having those conversations, because we couldn't report if we weren't actually doing anything. And so that has driven quite a different focus at Council. And it goes right down to, planning. I suspect that when we complete our next 10-year long-term plan, there will be significant focus on climate change, and particularly the adaptation and mitigation. That's where we're going to have to do quite a bit of work. But I suspect we will also be doing a lot about how do we actually get the whole of Tamamika Makaurau getting behind reducing each of our impacts on climate. So it's going to be trying to drive a behavioral change amongst the populace as well. And I think that's when we're going to start seeing quite a bit of change. But it's been driven by the Council and governing bodies and governance. That's where it's got to be driven, and that's where Council has started, and we've seen that being driven right through the organisation. I don't know if Helen would agree with me on that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And just an example of how we're starting to see this come through is, for our 10-year recovery budget, we developed multiple packages around with different climate activities, and each one of them went through really rigorous assessments to understand, what those co-benefits are. So what are the co-benefits for our environment, our communities? And I think we're seeing that with current financial planning processes that we're going through as well. It's not just, how does this reduce emissions or how does this address some of our climate risks? For us, especially at Auckland Council, we need to know that what we're investing in delivers co-benefits as well. And I think it should be the same for other organisations. And there's no reason why you can't deliver co-benefits with, climate activity as well.
Marcus, focusing in on that question just briefly in the few minutes we have left, do you see a space for that kind of, are we looking at the broader macro picture rather than an organizational view? Are we being radical enough in this space? Or are we, do we as a planet need to kind of ramp this up on our priority list sharpish?
Well, thank you. That's an easy question. I think the answer is no, we're not nearly responding strongly enough, if that's your question. I think we're way behind. I don't think too many would disagree with me on that. I'm not saying it's easy to do. It's because it requires us all to change individually and as organizations, as communities. And, change is always hard, but are we moving fast enough? No, not nearly fast enough. Climate change is happening. It's not 5 to 12, it's 5 past 12.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the big question is how do we do that? Because, in many respects, the status quo is still comfortable now, but it's making us all aware of how quickly that status quo will change. One last question, I think, is all we've got time for, and this one comes from James Hughes, who has a question regarding the types of transition risks that are front of mind for councils, given that the public sector context is far different when compared to the financial risks posed to private firms and the investment sector due to decarbonisation. So, again, probably aimed at Auckland Council, but Marcus or Mark, if you have any perspectives on this, given your interactions with councils, it'd be really interesting to hear about this, because they are quite fundamentally different once you dig into them.
I think that's maybe more a question for Auckland Council than for me, coming from James Hughes, I suspect.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So I think James, has hit the nail on the head. He is right. The transition risks that we look at are different, but at the same time, they're not. So, we still have to think about the legal, regulatory and policy risks and the financial risks as other organisations do. I think the interesting one that's going to be for us, and I guess this looks at it a little bit more broadly, is that, due to market and technological shifts, other sectors within the economy will tend to make that natural transition towards a low carbon economy. And for us here at Auckland Council, we've got to do a lot more to make that transition and be more proactive. And I think there's going to be, some of the transition risks we're already starting to be impacted by them. I mean, the fact that from next financial year, we're going to have to start reporting on our TCFD risks. Because we have bonds on the NZX is, just an example of how we're starting to see that play out. But we definitely, as local government, have to be more proactive in identifying those risks and addressing them ahead of time.
Looking at the clock, and apologies if I'm cutting any of our panelists off, but I think that's a fantastic place to end it there, given we're almost 2 minutes over. Could you all please give a virtual round of applause to our fantastic panelists who've been incredibly insightful? I know I'll be badgering them on a few topics after this. And thank you to our audience who joined us for this webinar, and of course, Tonkin and Taylor. So thank you very much. And with that, we sign out.
Thanks, Jason. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.